Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Liz Pimper, and I'll be your moderator for today's WJE webinar, Do Your Due Diligence, The Importance of Property Condition Assessments. During the next hour, WJE structural engineers Ken Kosteva and George Taylor will outline the property condition assessment process, highlight the importance of completing these assessments to support property purchase, as well as the development of repair and maintenance budgeting, and review examples of critical items identified through previous due diligence assessments. This presentation is copyrighted by Wis Jenny Elstner Associates. And now I'll turn it over to Ken to get us started. Ken?
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. George and I are excited to have the opportunity to review this topic with you today. The AIA learning objectives for this afternoon's presentation are provided on the screen. Our presentation this afternoon will include an overview of what a property condition assessment is and when they're completed, the timeline that PCAs are completed in, typical findings and limitations of assessments of this type, as well as a brief discussion of some non-destructive techniques and other tools that can be employed as part of a PCA. We'll close with several brief case studies that highlight the importance of completing a property condition assessment. So we'll start with the basics. What is a property condition assessment? As many of you likely know, assessments of varying degrees of comprehensiveness are regularly completed to evaluate the condition of structures of all shapes and sizes. These assessments may be completed in response to an event, such as a natural disaster, to evaluate performance issues such as water leakage, or to assess distress such as cracking of a concrete element. These evaluations can also be completed proactively as part of responsible property maintenance. The complexity, invasiveness, and time required to complete assessments varies, primarily based on comprehensiveness. Assessments can be very limited and brief, with accordingly limited findings, or they can be much more comprehensive, including detailed reviews, close-range surveys, inspection openings, non-destructive testing, and other means of establishing a highly detailed understanding of the condition of a structure. All of these assessments have their place. Today, we'll review a specific type of assessment, property condition assessment, or a PCA. PCAs are often referred to as pre-purchase surveys or due diligence surveys, and are typically high-level assessments completed in a short period of time to evaluate the general condition of buildings as part of commercial real estate transactions. This type of assessment is very similar to the inspection completed during the due diligence period of most residential real estate sales. The aim of a PCA is to provide the property purchaser with an overall or general understanding of the current condition of an asset, as well as future repair and maintenance needs, and often supports price negotiations. We'll start off by outlining the PCA process, or the who, what, when, and where of a PCA. PCAs are completed by a multidisciplinary group of specialty consultants. This group is typically led by one or more generalists. Typically, the generalist is a professional with extensive experience in the industry, and the generalist typically leads the assessment effort and assists and coordinates the various specialty consultants retained to evaluate specific systems. The PCA team typically includes consultants or specialists with experience assessing all aspects of the structure: topography, water management and drainage, flatwork and paving, ADA and related accessibility concerns, utilities, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, vertical transportation, interior finishes, and even other items. An ideal PCA team includes a group that is able to quickly and efficiently evaluate most all aspects of the structure. The PCA process includes 5 primary components, as you can see on the screen. And we'll discuss each one of these in more detail shortly. Each of these, document review, interviews, surveys, and reporting, including an opinion of probable cost, is completed by each of the specialty consultants and typically compiled by the generalist. As we mentioned previously, PCAs are most commonly completed as part of commercial real estate transactions. They're undertaken by the buyer in an effort to better understand current and future repair and maintenance costs. These assessments can also be completed proactively outside of property purchase. This is certainly less common, but is regularly undertaken by property owners, most typically condominium associations or similar groups with a keen eye towards capital planning. PCAs are most commonly completed on existing buildings that are well into their service term, but they can also be performed for recently completed buildings or even buildings that are under construction. And as you would probably expect, PCAs are completed nationwide. While most of them are completed on commercial assets, this type of assessment can really be completed on virtually any type of structure. As we noted above, there are 5 essential components to a complete PCA. Document review typically begins with the review of an offering memorandum, or OM, which is typically developed by the building seller and provided to prospective buyers. The OM includes basic building information, but is typically more geared towards other information important to prospective buyers, such as leasing information, growth potential in the area that the building is located, etc. In some cases, this is the only document provided for review. More often than not, there are some documents provided by the seller. The review is based on whatever documents are provided. It may include original construction documents, previous reporting of prior assessments or evaluations, even previous repair records. The aim of the document review period is to enhance the reviewer's understanding of the asset, its performance at present, as well as its repair and maintenance history. Interviews are typically conducted with some or all of the on-site property management team, including the on-site building engineer. These interviews allow the reviewer the opportunity to ask questions regarding the performance and repair history of the building. Interviews can be a very valuable tool when conducted with experienced and long-tenured staff. They often have incredible recollection of previous repair efforts and can provide extensive insight into current building performance. On-site surveys include both interior and exterior visual surveys. The surveys are almost exclusively limited to exposed conditions, and they're typically made from grade, sometimes with the aid of binoculars, and are also made from balconies, setbacks, and other areas that allow for a more detailed review. In general, the on-site survey work does not include close-range review of elevated areas such as the facade, exterior access, which is typically achieved with a ceiling stage or lift, is required to support that level of close-range survey. And again, while this isn't regularly done, it is sometimes included as part of the PCA. The interior surveys include accessing a representative portion of the interior spaces. This is typically less than 10% of the office suites or apartment units, for example. The interior survey also includes surveys of common spaces such as stairwells and interior systems such as the fire alarm panel. The reporting for a PCA is typically limited in nature, consistent with the extent of the evaluation, and generally includes information collected through the document review and interview process, as well as a summary of observations. Typically, these observations are presented in direct, subject understood language and include limited detailed descriptions. It's not the deep dive and detailed discussion that can be included for more comprehensive assessments. Reporting also includes categorizations of the general condition of the primary elements reviewed and recommendations for repair and maintenance, along with representative photos. The OPC, or Opinion of Probable Cost, is a cost table document that includes repair recommendations, estimated costs for recommended repairs, and maintenance items, as well as a timeline for when remedial action is required. This document is often the most important, or perhaps the better way to say it, the most influential aspect of the PCA process. One quick but important note, PCAs do share many similarities with reserve studies. That may be a term that you've come across. Reserve studies are often completed by property owners, specifically condominium associations, to develop long-term capital budgeting aimed at establishing an adequate cash reserve to fund future repair and maintenance needs. Reserve studies typically include both a physical analysis and a financial analysis. The physical analysis portion of the reserve study is similar to a PCA. I'll turn it over to George, who will discuss the primary elements of a PCA.
Thank you, Ken. One of the industry standards for the PCAs is the ASTM E2018, which is developed by ASTM International, which was formerly known as the American Society of Testing Materials, and it's an international standards organization that develops and publishes voluntary consensus technical standards for a wide range of materials, products, systems, and services. Most PCAs are conducted in general accordance with this document. This document defines the vocabulary terms, qualifications of the persons performing the PCA, survey requirements, elements to survey, the length of the survey, the minimum level of observations, documents that should be reviewed if available, and reporting requirements. It is the intent of this guide such that the survey should not be considered a technically exhaustive. It excludes the operation of equipment by the field observer and is conducted without the aid of special protective clothing, removal or relocation of materials, testing, or the use of equipment such as ladders, except required for roof access, stools, scaffolding, metering, testing equipment, or devices of any kind. It is literally the field observer's visual observations while walking through the subject property. The timing and start for a typical PCA is about 30 days and is governed by the buyer's due diligence period for purchasing the asset. Conditions are defined by ASTM and have contextual meanings. The reporting captures the overall general condition of each primary system being reviewed by using some of these definitions. Good, if the asset is in working condition and does not require immediate or short-term repairs. Fair, if the asset is in working condition but may require immediate or short-term repairs. Or poor, if it's not in working condition or requires immediate or short-term repairs. This is also justified via observations and photographs that you take. Another item that is mentioned is RUL, which is remaining useful life. It is important in evaluating the repairs that are likely required. RUL considers generally accepted service terms for the materials and systems, the observer's experience and observations. RUL is more applicable to systems with a more defined service terms and fewer variables, such as mechanical equipment, in a specific installation or control environment, but it's also used for sealant and roofing materials. The RUL is often used as a guide along with the conditions observed in the field. Routine maintenance items are generally excluded from PCAs, but however, significant maintenance items and those with large costs are often included. The typical systems reviewed for a typical PCA include the envelope, the building envelope, which is encompassed with the roof, the facade, plaza, if it exists, the garages, if there are any, either detached or attached, the fire life safety systems such as pumps, sprinkler systems, UL ratings of doors, existence of fire extinguishers, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing items, vertical transportation elements such as elevators and escalators, and accessibility, site conditions, and also, as Ken mentioned before, the interiors are also surveyed. I'll turn it over to Ken.
Thanks, George. Appreciate it. Now that we have an understanding of what's typically included in a PCA, we can discuss some of the typical findings and recommendations that often result from this type of assessment, as well as some of the typical items that are omitted from a limited assessment of this type. As is the case with all assessments, regardless of whether or not it's a PCA, conditions that pose a near-term safety risk are typically immediately brought to the attention of the client and or the current building owner. Commonly, these conditions create a risk for the public, such as loose material on a building facade that creates an overhead fall risk for pedestrians below, or non-functioning safety systems such as a fire alarm panel. Given the risk associated with these types of conditions, they're typically discussed in advance of the issue of any reporting, but of course they're also denoted in the report as being an immediate repair need. The most common need identified during a PCA, and one of the primary functions of the PCA, is identifying the need for repair of some type to address distress, deferred maintenance, and to maintain building performance. In a lot of ways, identifying repair and maintenance needs, particularly those with significant capital expenditures, is the primary aim of a PCA. The repairs identified during a PCA generally fall into three primary categories: complete replacement of a system or element, in situ repair of a system, or modification, the last two being somewhat related. Complete replacement is typically undertaken when a system can no longer be effectively maintained and or it's reached the end of its useful service life. These are typically large capital expenditures with a substantial effect on future budgeting. As many of you likely know, replacing roofing, windows, chillers, sprinkler systems, and other primary building elements typically comes with a very large cost and can be disruptive to building occupants as well. Repair of existing systems is, as I mentioned, the most common recommendation that typically results from a PCA. And the range here can be substantial, from minor repairs such as repainting metal handrails to much larger and more complex repair programs such as parking garage concrete repairs or even seismic retrofits. In some cases, existing systems are modified to improve performance and or to extend their useful service term in an economically friendly way. This type of modification is similar to in situ repair, but also changes the way a system performs. And a common example of system modification is window wet sealing, which modifies the water management of windows by converting drained window assemblies into a barrier system. And this type of repair, when completed correctly and on the right type of window assembly, can be a very effective means of deferring window replacement, which again is almost always a very large capital expense. PCAs do sometimes identify the need for upgrades to existing systems or elements. In some cases, upgrades are required to comply with applicable building codes. This is less common as most building elements or systems are generally considered to be grandfathered, but there are instances when authorities having jurisdiction or AHJs do require system upgrades as a result of modifications to the code. More commonly, upgrades are required based on obsolescence of parts to maintain the existing system. This is common with fire alarm panels and components of MEP systems. And depending on how outdated the in-service systems are, this might be something that's offered as an optional upgrade. That's a nice segue to the next typical recommendation, which is optional upgrades. Recommendations of this type are typically offered to improve performance, protect a component of the building, or to extend the useful service term of an element. A good example of a typical optional upgrade is the installation of a protective coating or waterproofing membrane to an exposed concrete parking garage slab. While this is not required for the parking garage to function in its primary capacity, the installation of this type of coating can significantly eliminate deterioration potential for the concrete slab. Essentially, this is an investment that's made to reduce potentially expensive future concrete repairs. As we'll note in the summary of PCA limitations, the assessment is almost always limited to the current usage of the asset. In some rare instances, clients do request a high-level, typically feasibility-style review of potential change in use, with the aim generally being to both evaluate whether or not the change in use is feasible, but also to consider other work that may be triggered by the change in use. As you can see in the image at right, the two areas highlighted in gray are denoted as proposed sound stages. As part of an assessment of this property, several considerations for usage were reviewed, including completing preliminary structural analyses of the main roof trusses above these spaces to determine if they had adequate capacity to support the speakers and other specialized equipment that would be needed to effectively convert this space to usage as a soundstage. The need for additional investigation is a common PCA recommendation, and this is primarily the result of the limited nature of property condition assessments. In general, additional investigation will be completed after the due diligence period. This typically requires that the reviewer estimate the likely repair need and associated cost so that there can be some recognition of that in the reporting and in the cost table, despite the need for the additional investigation. George is now going to cover several items, including limitations of PCAs.
Thank you, Ken. Some of the items that are typically excluded from PCAs that can also be negotiated, and depending on when you start the process, are close range surveys, either via a suspended scaffolding, industrial access techniques such as Baseine stairs, or a lift. These items have to be negotiated before the specialty consultant does those type of surveys. And it could be a requirement that the seller or buyer may want further information of their asset. Another item that is typically very uncommon are water testing surveys to detect, as the name says, if there's any leakage or infiltration coming in either from the facade, from the roof, or from any element that you're observing. 100% assessment of the asset is rarely completed unless specifically requested by the client, again, as an additional investigation. But typically, inspections are done on representative areas that are reviewed and the findings are extrapolated. Another item is analyses and design are typically excluded, and analyses are sometimes completed to assess the feasibility or assist with cost development for planned upgrade or modifications, or further design if some conditions are uncovered in the field where further investigation may be required. As Ken mentioned before, most of these items can become a recommendation from the PCA effort. Inspection openings, those are rarely done, but sometimes justified and permitted, and generally requires owner approval. Existing use is evaluated. Typically, there are too many unknowns associated with future use of an asset commentary on the impact of future use is sometimes provided. Future use is sometimes evaluated by another member of the PCA team or group, especially tasked with this common when large changes are planned. An example, a conversion from an existing use to a more different use for the building itself. Threshold costs are established for each project. The ASTM guideline typically specifies a minimum of $1,500, but higher limits are often employed when required. Other tools that can be used during the PCA process, non-destructive tools, are infrared thermography, which are used to evaluate the facade performance, typically air and water leakage of the facade. The thermography uses specialized equipment to determine potential areas of moisture or air infiltration. We do not recommend relying exclusively on these results, but these may be effective in justifying additional work. The data captured can provide a lot of information and detail with minimal cost, and these infrared thermographies are typically performed by a trained person and always will often require inspection openings to corroborate the results that were determined. Another non-destructive testing technique is acoustic sounding and water testing, as I just described before. And the chain drag or hammer sounding is often performed to identify hidden concrete distress conditions. It can be performed on horizontal and vertical surfaces, and the data captured can provide a lot of information as to condition of the facade or the garage itself, and it will help and aid in determining the cost or the amount of repair that will be required. Water testing, as the name implies, is used to identify or rule out areas of active water leakage in wall elements, roof elements, or plaza elements. Other useful tools that can be used during the PCA process are drone photography and videos. And the drone survey does provide a close-up view of areas of tough access. The images can be collected to create 3D models, and photogrammetry can be used to estimate the structure dimensions or other conditions. One of the issues with drone flying is that you have to have FAA approval to fly in certain zones, and you have to have a licensed pilot to perform that type of flying. Another tool that is very useful is the GigaPan, which is basically a robotic camera mount and a controller used to generate high-resolution images. The GigaPan is mounted on a separate tripod and is compatible with many types of cameras. Rather than documenting only portions of interest, the GigaPan allows for an entire facade to be documented in 10 to 15 minutes with hundreds of photographs that are later stitched together with a third-party program. It's useful when comparison between conditions at a point in time and some future time can be used. Another tool that is very useful that we've been using a lot are 360-degree cameras, which provide, as the name implies, a 360-degree view of the condition that is being observed. And it's also very useful to provide reference for other team members that cannot make the site visit, and so they can see some of the conditions that we're seeing. Best practices. What differentiates a good PCA? Typically, a PCA is staffed with more experienced persons, experience and familiarity with the systems that are being reviewed. You want to be able to perform a thorough review of available documents and have a seasoned eye as to know where issues or deficiencies within a particular system may exist. that person should have detailed knowledge of the systems, components, codes, repair techniques, repair costs for the elements that are being reviewed. It's good to have good industry connections and relationships so that you can also sound some of your findings with other men. And you have to have a good eye for rapid repair development and develop and repair costs to a cost table to support the conditions you're finding. The report structure for a PCA, as Ken had mentioned before, is basically divided by building systems, by element, and by building, as applicable. It will provide an overview of the property description, including the systems reviewed, with the summary of the documents that are reviewed, and the summary of interviews with the pertinent individuals made available by the seller to discuss previous and current asset conditions. Observations and discussions are typically combined as the level of the review does not justify more in-depth discussion. And recommendations are always included. And as Ken indicated, that one of the most important elements in the PCA is the cost table. Again, it follows the report itself that is divided by building system, element, and it will give you a description of items that are being repaired. It identifies immediate and future repair needs, typically over a 10-year period. It includes a brief description of the repair or maintenance item. It includes data regarding the useful life and remaining life of the asset. Costs are calculated either in a lump sum or with estimated quantities as appropriate. Also, cost alliance for items that can be difficult to price are sometimes provided. The OPC will suggest when the repair is recommended to be performed, and it's basically total per year on an each line item. And it also includes and could include a separate line item for optional repair work. I'll turn it over to Ken now for some case studies.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it. As George mentioned, we'll close the presentation with a brief review of 3 separate case studies that highlight both cautionary tales from PCAs and illustrate the need for this type of assessment, but also a project where work completed during a PCA alleviated concerns that were raised by the buyer prior to the visual survey being completed. We'll cover 3 separate properties, as I mentioned. 2 are hotel properties in Washington, D.C., and it's strictly coincidental that we're including hotel properties. And then also an industrial building in Emeryville, California, just outside of San Francisco. A PCA was completed as part of the sale of this large hotel in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And during the course of the on-site interior and exterior visual surveys, hotel renovations were ongoing. At the time of our visual survey, we were able to enter multiple hotel rooms, which were in varying degrees of renovation. And during the course of these interior surveys, conditions indicative of uncontrolled water leakage were identified at several of the hotel rooms. This included staining and damage to interior finishes, as well as damage and staining on interior finishes, specifically drywall that had been removed as part of the hotel renovations, and interior finishes, specifically wallpaper, that were removed during the renovation program. As George mentioned, best practices for this type of assessment include interviewing the on-site maintenance and engineering staff. This exercise was completed and interviews were conducted with those folks. Unfortunately, and for reasons that were unknown, the on-site staff failed to divulge that they were in the midst of an ongoing investigation of exterior wall performance. They had another consultant on board that was performing a fairly detailed assessment of exterior wall performance, specifically an investigation into water leakage. That investigation, as I mentioned, was ongoing and included access to the exterior of the building, close-range visual surveys, and water penetration testing, all things that George mentioned as being items typically done during a more comprehensive assessment and omitted from this type of PCA. Through a series of discussions with industry contacts and really discussions with the firm completing the investigation, as well as requests that were made by the buyer to the seller to provide additional information, the extent and nature of the ongoing investigation was exposed. And it was ultimately deemed to be fairly substantial, including, again, identifying pretty significant concerns with performance of the exterior wall assemblies. Based on the nature of the investigation and the extensiveness of the repairs that were required to address water leakage, the property sale was significantly delayed. Ultimately, the sale was completed, but not until after the seller had completed fairly extensive repairs. The next case study is a pretty unique property acquisition. The subject building, as you can see in the photo at left, is an older property. It's actually a property that is registered as a National Historic Landmark building, and it previously served as the United States General Post Office in Washington, D.C. After a relatively long period of government office usage, the property was, for a brief period of time, taken out of service or mothballed, but was ultimately converted to commercial use as part of a long-term lease negotiated with the property's actual owner, which is the GSA, or General Services Administration. The adaptive reuse program was completed in 2000 and converted the existing historic building into a modern hotel. A PCA was conducted in 2010 as part of a sale of the long-term lease with GSA. And as you can see in the photo, the exterior of the building is primarily stone and includes several highly articulated elements, such as the column capitals. And during the course of the exterior survey portion of the PCA, several instances of loose stone material or spalls were identified. The spalls, in many cases, were completely dislodged, but they were contained by bird netting that was installed at the upper cornice area, which is immediately above the column capitals. In addition to noting the spalls that were contained within the bird netting, there was also several pieces of stone material that were collected in the small setback space between the sidewalks that surround the building and the building itself. There were also several incipient spalls or loose material that were noted on the stone facade. And based on the risk associated with both the loose material or incipient spalls as well as the spalls that were contained in the bird netting, which obviously isn't intended to function in that capacity, were immediately raised with both the seller and the buyer, and also with the actual building owner, GSA. This was all done during the due diligence period. And actually near the end of the due diligence period, but prior to sale of the property, a large piece of stone dislodged from the building and fell onto the public sidewalk along 7th Street. Fortunately, nobody was injured during this event, but it did result in the need for significant repairs. Those repairs were completed by the seller with oversight by a consultant that was hired by the buyer to ensure that the repairs were completed in a reasonable manner. As you might imagine, the PCA reporting included a recommendation for a more detailed evaluation of the exterior stone walls. This evaluation was completed soon after the long-term lease transfer was completed, and it resulted in the development of a comprehensive exterior repair and maintenance program that remains ongoing. The final case study is less of a cautionary tale, but does highlight another potential outcome of a PCA. This industrial property was reviewed as part of a very large multi-building property sale. The subject building housed a number of individual and small manufacturing operations, including a high-end chocolatier. And prior to the on-site survey being completed, the buyer did a walk of the interiors and identified cracking in the slab immediately above the chocolatier's primary manufacturing space. As you can see in the photos, cracking was identified and present on the underside of the slab near a column capital. This is shown in the photo on the left. And cracking was also observed on the top side of the slab, as is shown in the photo at right. The reviewer for the PCA was notified of this cracking. As I mentioned, the seller had completed a preliminary walkthrough of the space. They brought this to the attention of the reviewer so that it could be emphasized during the PCA study. The owner's concerns were not just limited to potential repair to address the cracking, but more so potential impact on the manufacturing operations of the space below, and quite honestly, potential costs associated with temporary shutdowns of that space. This cracking was able to be reviewed in more detail as part of the PCA, and very brief structural analyses were completed. These analyses ultimately determined that the cracking did not require repair, and accordingly, there was no need for a recommendation for any type of remedial action. To close, a couple of key takeaways from the presentation. Property condition assessments, as George mentioned, are guided by industry-recognized documents and aim to provide a high-level roadmap for future repair and maintenance needs. Typically, they're completed in support of commercial property purchase, but that's certainly not a requirement. They may identify the need for further, more comprehensive investigation, analyses, or testing to better understand latent deficiencies or other conditions identified during the assessment. While typically completed as part of property transfers, PCAs can also be an effective tool in the development of responsible capital planning and budgeting. Thank you all for attending. George and I hope that you found this discussion of property condition assessments to be informative, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ken. As a reminder, please type your questions into the Q&A box and hit submit. And we'll try to get to all the questions before the end of the hour, but if we aren't able to get to your question, either Ken or George will follow up with you afterward. All right, our first question. Are drones being used for exterior surveys now?
I can answer that. And yes, the drones are being used for exterior surveys, but like I mentioned before, drones are guided by the FAA, so you do have to do your due diligence and make sure that you are not in any unauthorized flying space when the drone survey is being performed. And drones are also you need to be a licensed drone pilot to fly a drone, or else you can be in trouble. So, yes, they can be used. They have to be negotiated into the PCA, but yes, they can be used.
Okay, our next question. Do you find sellers do not or are not required to divulge known problems such as water leakage, etc.?
George, I'm happy to take that one if you'd like. I think for the most part, my experience would be that sellers are typically very forthright with providing as much information as they can. The example that we provided of the hotel that was experienced water leakage and there was a failure to divulge that information has certainly been a rare instance in my experience. And I think in some cases when there isn't information provided in a forthright manner, it might be a function of the on-site management team or the engineering folks feeling like they're put under the microscope. This type of assessment is typically completed in a relatively short time frame. And as I mentioned, it might include a team of 10, 15, or even 20 specialty consultants and financial analysts. So it can be pretty overwhelming for the on-site property folks. And there might be a little bit of a tendency to provide less information, or maybe not feel like they're in a position where they should divulge that there are issues with the building. But in my experience, pretty rare for there not to be information provided in a forthright manner.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it's not a requirement that they have to provide, but, that's one of the reasons that we do the due diligence, is to try to identify some of those conditions.
Okay, our next question. Can you discuss your experiences with some of the available repair cost databases?
That's a really good question. There are certainly a multitude of recognized cost databases that are available in the industry. I think George would agree that the most valuable cost database that we have is one that's developed internally and comes from WJE being a firm that completes a large number of repair and restoration projects and does so across the country. That allows for the development of not only a cost database that has representative real-world information included in it, but also one that has geographic influences represented as well. And those can be significant. There are, without question, some buildings that will require, or some areas where buildings are repaired at a higher or lower cost. And so we're able to represent that in an internal cost database. That's certainly, I think, in my experience, been more representative actual repair costs than any of the kind of generally available industry documents.
Okay, our next question. Would you recommend a PCA on top of a reserve study? What would be the frequency of the PCA for an HOA condo complex?
I can take that one, Ken. The PCAs and reserve studies are pretty similar, so you're getting basically the same type of information from both of them. So I do recommend maybe performing one over the other. Pick one. I do not recommend more intervals more than maybe less than 10 years for them, as things may change. I don't know, Ken, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, George, I think the only additional element that I would offer there is that in most cases, a reserve study includes a pretty significant financial model. That's a really great tool that's part of that. And again, I think for condominium associations or similar groups, whether they be residential or condominium associations that include office or other commercial properties, that's a really effective tool to assist with future budgeting. So I would think George is right in offering that there's a significant amount of overlap between those two.
Okay, our next question. In a PCA, do you do building code reviews and ADA assessments?
I can take that. Yes, that's part of the PCA, and they're done by specialty consultants that specialize in doing that type of assessment. So, yes, it can be included. It has to be obviously negotiated at the start of the PCA if you want that level of review there.
Okay, our next question. Does repair and maintenance only involve significant capital, or do you typically incorporate property management recurring maintenance?
Typically, any large capital expense would be represented as part of a PCA. Any type of property management recurring maintenance, certainly something that would typically be done by the on-site engineering staff or something that's contracted with a local agency to provide. Those are typically not included in a PCA, but maybe less frequent and more costly typical maintenance items would be included in a PCA.
Okay, our next question. What are the most common findings in high-rise apartment buildings?
I guess both Ken and I can answer that, but I'll take a first stab at it. And, we'll go by our experience, Obviously depends on what type of building, but some of the findings are your exterior facade is a big one. Your roofing condition is always a big one. Windows, depending on the age of the asset itself. Elevators are also pretty big. And if you need to do any upgrades regarding fire life safety. Ken, do you have any others that you would like to add?
George, I think that's a great summary. What I would add is that for some high-rise buildings, that might be the time when it would be beneficial for an owner to engage that close range survey either via suspended scaffolding or a man lift. It's difficult to complete a visual assessment of the exterior of a high-rise building exclusively from grade, and doing a couple of drops via swing stage to allow for a close range assessment can provide a significant amount of additional information, which may have a big impact on short or long-term repair and maintenance needs.
Okay, our next question. Is the PCA an engineering work product?
Yeah, that's a good question. I presume the question there really relates to, is it being a stamped work product? Certainly there are requirements for there to be folks involved with appropriate experience, but the PCA reporting and cost estimate are not typically the type of work product that would come with a stamp and signature from a professional engineer or from a licensed architect.
Okay, our next question. In a residential condominium, what would be a decent percentage of unit balconies to access for understanding typical conditions of a building balcony / handrails? Does it vary depending on the number of stories?
Another good question. Typically, I can answer that one, Ken. I typically go maybe 10% of the units. That's what the ASTM standard kind of requires 10%. But obviously, a little bit more can be done if the conditions warrant it. But a good rule of thumb is 10% of the units will give you a good understanding of the conditions.
Hey, George, I think that's a really good number. And on top of that, I would offer, I think you alluded to this, if you do identify conditions of distress that you believe would require repair, I would offer that it would be beneficial certainly to see a larger percentage so that you are in a position to have more information and offer a more accurate repair estimate.
Okay, our next question. When organizing your OPC, do you use a standard like CSI?
George, I can handle that one. The OPC typically does not use a standard broken out by divisions like CSI. In most cases, it would be divided by building, if that's applicable to the property, if it's a multi-building asset. It would then be subdivided by the system, right? So it would be structural, facade, roofing, fire, life safety. Those would be the typical breakdowns included in the PCA. And then each one of the items that's a repair and maintenance need would be given some type of typically alphanumeric designation. So it's typically broken down by building and then broken down by aspect of the building and then further subdivided by specific building elements. So in the case of something like fire and life safety, you would have a section that might be applicable to fire alarm, and then you might have a section that's applicable to the sprinkler system as a different element.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Who should I call if I need help with a property condition assessment?
George, I think you would probably agree that reaching out to a firm like Wish-Janney with extensive experience in not only evaluating existing structures, but also repair of those existing structures would be a great place to start, as would a similarly experienced firm.
Yeah, and you can give us a call and we can point you in the right direction, or if other specialty consultants are required or a generalist is required to perform the assessment, we can point you in the right direction.
All right. Thank you, George, and thank you, Ken. That is all the time that we have for questions today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. We hope it's been educational. If you have any questions about today's presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to Ken or to George. Their information is there on your screen. And if you have any questions about WJE webinars, please reach out to me, Liz Pemper, at lpemper@wje.com. So again, thank you so much for your time today, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.